The J. Michael Show.
Welcome to the show. Today we're talking to Daniel Jones. He is a Bigfoot researcher, a UFO researcher, a lot of research into mysteries. Let's welcome Daniel.
It's good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Appreciate you having me.
All right. So you are kind of known for the Aurora, Texas crash, right? What can you tell me about that?
So this is a fun legend that originated 127 years ago, this week actually, in an old news story. My involvement has been looking at the historical information that's been out for decades now and compiling it and giving it some commentary to make available all in one place. Basically, the story came out in the Dallas Morning News in April, on the 19th of April in 1897. And it discussed a crashing of a ship, an airship. They called these not UFOs at the time, but airships. And this isn't an isolated report or story, but at the time, there were several sites.
This was like the 1800s, right?
1897. And so at the end of the 1800s, we actually did have conventional airships and dirigibles, and these kind of stemmed out of the inventions of hot air balloons and blimps into the early 1900s, which you can see later on. We know we had the Flyer, which was the Wright brothers plane, and this wasn't until a few years later, but the Aurora story really is kind of in the center of many different sightings or reports of sightings and stories of newspapers at the time that were all describing something that had been seen, and many of the accounts of these airships were all different. They basically described something that looked somewhat like a blimp, but had maybe something like a gondola that people were seeing, other maybe pilots or occupants inside.
Well, at the time, this was very unusual to see anything in the sky, right? I mean, an airship or whatever. No, most people had never seen a balloon.
It's something that a lot of people are kind of caught off guard with because most of us are thinking about the conventional stories in history of the Wright brothers, and that's not until 6 years later in 1903. But the airship stories were pretty interesting because not only were they very sensational, and people had considered what was the reality behind them. Were they all just made up stories of yellow journalism? Were they hoaxes, or were people actually seeing things? And I think it's pretty curious that there were so many different reports in such a concentrated period of time and in various locations, not just in Texas, but California and the Midwest. When it comes to the Aurora, Texas story, and by the way, Aurora is northwest of Fort Worth, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, about 20 minutes or so northwest of Fort Worth. And basically, this story stands out from amongst the other airship stories in a period or sort of episode of these sightings in the course of 1897 called the Great Airship Mystery. Right. Basically, they all describe seeing these strange flying objects, many of which were considered to be inventions by people. You know, some inventor was clever enough to
experimenting with hot air balloons or something.
Right. And so some of these stories describe people, the crew, the pilot sometimes, the captain coming out and talking with some of the, the observers, the witnesses, and kind of giving some details here and there, but telling them to not get too close. So there's some fun commentary in a lot of these stories. What I find interesting about the Aurora story, and I regard it as a legend or folklore because there's so much to the story that people have looked into by way of field investigations and historical records and things that make us wonder, is there really any truth to it? But why the Aurora story stands out from the other airship mysteries is that it deals with the element of the pilot, which was described as being possibly inhabitant of the planet Mars, and that because not only was this a sighting, the report describes that an object was seen coming down from the south, and not just being seen in the sky, but it came down and crashed into the windmill by a water tower and destroying a flower garden. And so because of this tremendous wreck, the townsfolk came over, and it describes that they had seen a lot of the debris, and alongside the debris they saw the pilot badly mangled and that enough of the original of his body perhaps was recovered to determine that it says, quote, he was not an inhabitant of this world. So I think that this is a fun story because it is a little bit different take than the regular airship stories, which kind of
Right.
seem a bit more, like you had mentioned, a bit more man-made, something that maybe
Right.
someone had crafted in a hangar or some kind of a, laboratory. But this story talks about someone, a pilot perhaps from another world. And I think that's fun because you have science fiction basically emerging. It's in its infancy. The following year, 1898, you had War of the Worlds. And so people were talking about Martians and the idea that you had beings from other worlds. And so I think that while...
And at that time, the scientists were seeing canals and lines on Mars, which was actually an optical illusion in their telescope, right? But they were thinking that, well, there's life there. There's got to be people there because somebody had to make the canals. So Mars was prominent in that area of, in that time that a lot of people were thinking that that's where these craft were coming from, Mars.
It's certainly something that I think was kind of sweeping the social concept of people from other worlds at the time, rather than interstellar travelers,
Right.
Or intergalactic. We were looking at a little bit closer of a celestial neighbor. Like Mars is right next to us, so it would make sense for people to consider otherworldly people from Mars. And I think
Right.
that there's no real way, some people ask how would they have known he's from Mars specifically. Well, obviously that's just a bit of colorful interpretation on the part of a Mr. T.J. Weems, who is attributed to having made the claim that he was from Mars. And I was actually able to find his grave nearby Aurora. And so he was buried in 1925 when he passed away, but he's the reason, I think, in part, other than the author of the original article, S.E. Hayden, who, whether he concocted it or it was real, some people, it's still very contested. Obviously, my interest in it has gone in different ways over the years, and I find that aside from trying to look at it as a provable case or not, that I think it's rich in its cultural value. In history, you have all these stories that, despite the reality, they have an impact on where we go in the future, or where we're looking at how some of those can help give us a sense of what we're doing in our world now and how it can kind of guide us into what kind of world we're making it. And I think the thing with this story when it comes to Aurora is that not only did they look at this, and again, whatever way that this is being interpreted, the fun part is that the story basically shows that the townsfolk were compassionate enough to gather up the remains and give this pilot from Mars, perhaps, a funeral. And I think that shows that they had a bit of compassion in their hearts for someone from another world. They didn't burn it, whether that happened or not. The story didn't describe them looking at it in an aggressive way or almost a damning way of it being like a demon or something, So they, I think what's nice about
They gave it a Christian burial.
Right, and it's something that I think should give us a sense of how we may be able to work together and looking at not just otherworldly beings, but ourselves. And I think that it's something that should help encourage a bit of compassion when it comes to other life, whether it's terrestrial life or extraterrestrial life or any kind of life. That it shows that there's still some good-hearted people out there that no matter where you come from, we should have honor and respect for one another either way. And despite, for whatever reason, it may have crashed, if that's the case at all, that regardless, we are able to honor them by putting them to rest. And so this story has been recognized officially by the Texas Historical Commission with a historical marker there at the cemetery where it said that this pilot was buried. And a lot of people go to the grave sort of as a pilgrimage and leave tokens or some kind of a tributary item that signifies their acknowledgement of this interesting story. It's been featured in so many newspapers, and up until today, it's probably one of the most widely publicized stories of an otherworldly encounter almost ever, probably next to Roswell. And a lot of people don't realize that. And 50 years ago, there were some serious investigators going out to the property where this is all said to have happened and really tried to find some of the debris, the wreckage, the strange metal.
They've tried to dig up the grave of this alien, right?
Well, that's where things really came to a screeching halt because there was real interest in trying to exhume this alleged body of what people presumed to be an extraterrestrial. And of course, this is an incredible idea to think that if there really is something there, not from this world, then that would be a life-changing, historical-changing event. But
Right. You could dig up an alien body, even just the bones there would be awesome to have.
it would be something that I think we could all learn from. But the reality is that the Cemetery Association threatened with a counter lawsuit saying that for anyone who came digging, they would sue them. And so the cemetery got put on watch for about 2 weeks. And right when that ended, the stone that was used to mark this pilot's grave went missing. And my buddy, the late Jim Mars, he was there on scene back in the 1970s. This was 1973. He was working with an aviation writer for the Dallas Morning News, the same newspaper actually. And this guy, Bill Case, he was really a big promoter of this story in the newspaper at the time. It reached a lot of people. It was republished through the Associated Press, and he's a big reason why people outside of Texas learned about it as well. And this story was virtually dormant for decades until the late 60s. People started talking about it outside of the regional area of Aurora, because up until then it was probably just sort of a word-of-mouth urban legend type of thing to the extent that it was virtually unknown to anyone outside of Aurora, or if they had moved away from Aurora into some other part of Texas. But
you mentioned Jim Mars, a mutual friend of ours. He was the writer of Crossroads, which the JFK movie was based on. What was the name of it? Crossfire, yeah. The JFK movie was based on that, the Oliver Stone movie. He wrote that. And he was also prolific in UFO investigations. And he and I went out to the cemetery and actually looked at the area where the alien is supposed to be buried, but there was no stone there then. Now, he had a replica at his house of what the stone looked like. But is there a stone there now?
That's a really good question. So the idea of there being a stone at all has been widely contested. The thing with the whole idea of the grave is troubling because, truthfully, that cemetery was not the original cemetery at the time in 1897.
That I didn't know.
After talking to several of the people at the Wise County Historical Society, I realized, and I'm not the only one, earlier investigators had found this out as well, but Aurora had about 2 or 3 cemeteries. And there's only one now. But something had happened to cause the town to not only reposition some of the main buildings, but also to relocate the cemetery. So one of the biggest detractors or elements of the hoax theory or proposition is that the cemetery that we all know and is recognized for this story is not the original cemetery, and that the ideas of being having a body transferred from the original cemetery to the one that's here currently, there was no record of any type of internment.
Now, have you been able to find where the original cemetery was?
There's a place a bit close to the what some people like to call the crash site, which is where Judge Proctor, J.S. Proctor, had a property up on the north part of town, which is what the story describes, with a tower of the windmill, the water tower, the well, a water trough, and a flower garden, basically a farm. And the Proctors were a real family. And it's contested whether he was a judge or whether they just called him that. He was a part of the Justice precinct, and I think that there's some confusion about certain roles of the people who are described in the article. I know we're jumping to a lot of different things here, but it's important to kind of lay out some of the context around the story, because there's a lot of missing information that people kind of go out on a limb to make assumptions about this legend, and I think it's really important to maybe clarify. And it's through a lot of the historical research that I've looked into and that others have as well. But to your question about the cemetery, it's a place that isn't really accessible now as a cemetery, but it's a property that's owned by some people that basically a lot of the graves were moved by a man named Slimp. His last name was Slimp, and he told some of the people in the historical society that there was no recollection of an alien being transferred. Obviously, that's kind of a strange thing to really know for sure, but the stone that had been in place, at least in the 70s, in the current cemetery was not a nice marble headstone or anything like that you see on all the other graves, which are...
Well, I've seen a replica of it. It's just kind of an oval that had like a disc or something, or stars drawn on it, and an X or something, and you really didn't know what it was.
Well, Jim had seen it and took some pictures and knew some people that were aware of its location. Whether it was there the whole time or not, Jim knew where it was, and other people did too, for whatever its purpose was. I talked with some of the old-timers there in town, and I asked if they knew if that stone that you're describing there, it's kind of a crude rock that was hewn just to put in with an etching. Jim Mars thought that if you looked at it as a broken rock, that it had another half that showed a full etching of what he interpreted as a spaceship. That's kind of fun. That's very speculative, but it's kind of a fun idea to think that maybe there was a little bit more to the stone at some point. People had been etching something into it or breaking pieces off to take. But that was in the 70s when it was known. Other people have gone and said that there wasn't a headstone. Kevin Randall, who has looked into UFOs and Roswell and all of these things for a long time, he went in the early 70s, about 1970 or 71, and he described not being able to find a headstone. He also talked to a lot of people in town and did his own investigation. But I talked to people who said that they don't recall ever having seen a headstone there before 1970. So the challenge is if the original headstone was actually legitimately an original one, or if someone put it in place to sort of signify the story. Because that's an ongoing issue. We know that did happen later on. Someone did come in 2012 and put in a similar stone with a disc-shaped etching. And that actually gets confused as the original headstone quite a bit. And that was only there for a good year until it also disappeared. And a colleague of ours, Tui Snyder, who we were with about a year ago at another event.
Yeah, at this Paracon, wasn't it, or a different one?
Yeah, and so she actually photographed that more recent headstone, and her picture gets shared around a lot, but people mistake it as the so-called original. It only was there for about a year and disappeared in 2013. And then about 2 years later, the city, with the, I would say backing of Dr. Tony Wheeler at the time, she was the city administrator, they were doing some excavating and uncovered a large stone, very large stone, about this big, a little bit bigger than actually. And they decided to use that because of its strange sort of disc-like shape to put out on the within the proximity of where this original stone was.
Just a quick note in case the audience can hear applause. We are at the East Texas Paracon, and we're backstage, and so you'll sometimes maybe hear some of the applause that's going on. But anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. No,
it's great, and we're here talking about all these interesting subjects, and people are always fascinated about this story. It comes up a lot.
Now, is there a marker there today? Yeah,
to your original question. So what's really interesting about that is that just the other day we had the anniversary on the 17th of the idea of this taking place on April 17th, 1897. I went out, as I often do each anniversary. I try to make it out there to just give an update and see what everything looks like. Well, I went out there, and I was there at about 10:30 in the morning, and that big stone was there. The one that had been put into place about 2015 by Dr. Tony Wheeler, the former city administrator, now former. And then I left, and then I had a friend who came about 3 hours later and said it was not there anymore.
Ooh, wow.
And in place of it were 3 new, very structured, carved headstones that look like they're marking pre-existing burial plots that weren't recognized previously. The big stone, it looks like this was all done on official business by, I would presume, the Cemetery Association, which the city of Aurora is not affiliated with. The big stone I found was nearby the exit gate, so it's not stolen as the other ones seem to have been taken. They moved it, I think, for a few different reasons. I don't know for sure. I'm hoping to find out some official answers at their meeting coming up, but it looks like they're recognizing some pre-existing burial plots. So there's nothing there right now other than something that looks like it's showing that there is a burial, but there are 3. Right. So, people came and they put little tokens and things on the stone coins, little alien things, and it was like a pilgrimage people would make very regularly. And sometimes
that raises a question, like if someone wanted to go to that cemetery in Aurora as a tourist, are there guided tours, or can you get in there?
Well, other than some of the things that I've done and helped the city with over the years, there's no official tour given. There's no person or department that they have that operates in that way at all. The closest thing I think that people can enjoy if they go out to Aurora is the cemetery does have the historical marker. It was installed in 1976 thanks to Rosalie Gregg, who wrote out a manuscript which was submitted to the Historical Commission in Texas, and they approved it and put in one of those markers that you see in a lot of these places all over the state. Right. And it recognizes that this site is well known for the legend, as it says, the legend that a spaceship crashed and the pilot was buried here. So for people that know where it is, you could still go over there, and I'm sure that'll continue to happen. Other than the cemetery's historical marker, there is a city monument that was erected after an event that I did with Jim Mars and others in 2016. After that event, the following year in 2017, they erected the city's monument that shows not only a stylized city logo, but a crashed spaceship next to a mock-up windmill with a little pilot shaped like an alien. So they really encouraged the theme of the UFO and the spaceship and the alien crash. Despite, what some people say about the town and the interest or disinterest, to see that this small town, the city of Aurora, is not very big. They can't become Roswell overnight or anything. So to think that they were even able to encourage people to come and look at their monument, I think is a big step toward wanting people to know that this is an interesting part about their history. Because otherwise they don't really have much else that anyone would know them for unless you are familiar with a bit of pioneer history. They had an air base during World War II. And I think that some of the other interesting historical things are only kind of well known to the local community. Everyone else, whoever's heard of Aurora, will almost immediately associate it with the UFO crash of the windmill and the alien grave.
Right. So let me ask you a question, just kind of a point blank. Do you believe a UFO crashed in Aurora, Texas?
I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and my interpretation of the information is as such. When you have people who've gone through looking at analysis of metal fragments and from metal that has been found out there, who suggest that something with immense heat did burn the area, that makes me wonder if there's really anything to that or not. While at the same time, you have people showing that there's no mentioning of it in the Wise County, which is where Aurora is situated, the Wise County historical texts. There's no record of an interned pilot outside of the original report. The witnesses who were interviewed by various people about 50 or so years ago at this point, it depends on who you listen to. Some say it happened, some say it didn't. My view on it is that I don't believe that a UFO or airship crashed simply out of maybe the semantic of believing it, because I have to remain objective, and I think that it's a fun story, but I just have to go with what data is available and what the information can show. And unfortunately, it's insufficient for me anyway, to suggest that I would encourage anyone to believe in the story outside of just looking at it as folklore, which is what I encourage, in the sense that it can inspire us, again, to be more compassionate, and also to consider the possibilities that maybe there are accounts that we can still look at, or that are potentially happening now or in the future, that do deal with something of this incredible phenomenon. And so, in summation about this idea, I would find that there's a lot of speculation. A lot of people do believe this story,
right,
but without much knowledge about it. And I think that my effort has been to really dig into everything that I can. Every possible inclusion in any multimedia is something that I've been looking into. And so I have gone outside of looking at it as a happened or didn't happen situation. And I think that helps me to appreciate the
even if it's just a romantic story of the late 1800s and a Martian crashed or whatever,
right?
Or if in reality something did indeed crash, it's still important to keep the history alive, the information about it, and let people decide what they want to believe. So the historical aspect of it, be it true or not, is very important. And the work you're doing is great. Well,
I appreciate that. I'm doing what I can. It's an ongoing work in progress, of course, but doing what I can to compile all of that information and research that I've done through historical documentation and even things leading up to the sort of modern time frame, to encapsulate all of that onto a database that's accessible for people to go to online and look at for themselves. And I think that's really important, because there really hasn't been a central place for this information. A lot of it's been put together in different projects
bits
or publications
pieces here and there,
and it usually steers the story in one way or the other, either as an extreme outlook of it definitely happened as a fun alien fantastic story, or it was all just bluntly a hoax. And the problem with both of those is it doesn't really show why we think either of those, or whatever situation. So what I've tried to do is really track down the source of any indication either way. And I like to say fact, fiction, or folklore. This is everything I can find, and I think it's important to showcase that without trying to push one narrative or the other, but to show all the ways it had been featured. So that's been a big project I've focused on for a while, and I just refer to it as Aurora, a Texas Legend from 1897.
I like
don't
your
even
line, fact, fiction, or folklore.
Yeah.
It could be anything.
Yeah. I don't really, yes, I've used the terms UFO crash and alien grave simply because that's what it has been known for, and I think it's fun. And of course, we can be hopeful that the story is real, as weird as that sounds, and in some way, it's too bad that if we take it for face value that the pilot wrecked and died, unfortunately. I hope that that's not really the case, but if anything, I hope that maybe we can utilize stories like this to kind of give us a sense of how we come together despite tragedy, and really overcome some of these difficult situations, to still remember that we're honorable, and we can respect each other despite our backgrounds.
Most of your UFO crash stories, it's the nefarious government steps in and sequesters the alien away, or the spaceship away, and it becomes this big mystery as to what really happened.
Right.
But this has it actually has a kind of a beautiful ending to a saucer or a ship is seen. It crashes into a windmill. The alien body is there, but they give it a Christian burial. They they treat it with respect.
Right.
And so even if it isn't a true story, it's a great story that, as you said, it speaks more to humanity than aliens.
Yeah, I think one of the fun interpretations that people have seen is, or that can be seen, is the movie that was made, sort of a B film called Aurora Encounter, and it was made and inspired in part by E.T.
That was made in the 1980s, wasn't it?
1986, not
Yeah.
too long after E.T., which
Yeah.
I think it sort of rode the coattails from. But similarly, it's about not a evil invading alien species or something to that effect, but
Exactly.
it shows a nice alien, and we find out the bad guys are the people, and so
Right.
it's one of those things that they took some liberties. It's pretty wild, but the alien doesn't immediately perish.
Right.
They let him go around town and have some fun. And one of the fun things about that movie is that it was a boy who had progeria who got to play the alien, and
Absolutely.
that might seem a little bit morbid, but the reality is that he had
But
been
it was,
part of
it
a
was his
Make-A-Wish.
wish. Yeah, it was
Make-A-Wish
his
Foundation.
wish to be in it.
And I was able to, and he passed away not long after that movie, and I was able to get a original theatrical release movie poster that he signed, and so I have that as part of my collection of Aurora memorabilia, and I think it's just fun to see all the ways in which this story again had been portrayed through various mediums is incredible, because there's almost nothing else like it, maybe next to Roswell and some of these others. But you made a good point about how a lot of these other UFO crash stories are very menacing and
Yes.
sinister. This is, it's a little bit more lighthearted, but it's also telling about, like you said, the sort of emotional value of how he handled it. And it's also well beyond, way before any modern idea of this UFO crash retrieval concept.
Yeah.
And I think it just shows that these are not new ideas really at all. This is something that's been with us in our social psyche
Right.
for well over a century at this point. This is the 127th anniversary pretty much this week,
Yeah.
So it's incredible to consider how things have, as far as the UFO field, the people involved with this topic, where things have come, even in the more recent years,
Right.
since all of this time.
So you said that recently they had an event there in Aurora. Is this going to be something annual? Will it continue to? Are they going to continue to do it?
I was fortunate enough to work with Jim Mars and the city of Aurora back in 2015 to hold an event the following year in 2016. The city called it the Aurora Alien Encounter. There were many incredible logistical challenges, and I'd like to say it's the one and only, because we tried it again the next year. There were many more challenges, and unfortunately Jim Mars passed away, and so the event came to an end. I had taken it upon myself to do some meetups and tours and things of the historical sites out there, but in a few years after that. But there hasn't been an official event acknowledged or supported by the city since then, and I don't know that there will be, because of recent changes in the city administration and personnel.
So they're not like against it, but there's no current thing that's annual that's going to continue to happen.
I think it would be fun to see something that can encourage something like a folklore festival. I think that would be fun to bring the community together, because they don't really have much else going on. But as far as the outlook within, I'd say it's always been divided, and currently I think mostly people are a bit indifferent about it. From an official stance, it's not really highly regarded or acknowledged. I think almost it might be seen as a bit of a nuisance for some, and others
Right.
think it's a fun story. For every person I've talked to within the city, everyone's got a different and maybe somewhat personal
Right.
situation. 'Cause some people have been in Aurora their whole lives, and some people came in and got involved with the city council and things. So
Yeah.
everyone's looking at it differently. But for the people who I've talked to who are at least willing to share either way, whether they are for it or not, I think that that's important for them to acknowledge that this story will be there, that people will find it interesting well after you or I or the city council or anyone who's there. It's going to be around for a long
For a
time.
long
And I
time.
think that if they don't find a way to utilize that in an effort to encourage community events, or I would even say that some people would find this to be borderline exploitation or commercialism. The challenge is that you already have all of those things with any part of society anyways. And the thing with something like Aurora is that I think it encourages open-mindedness, it encourages historical appreciation, it encourages people within not just the niche UFO community, but those who are on sort of the outlying enthusiast interest level to say, hey, this is a fun bit of mystery in Texas folklore. It's a bit of a lesser-known story that is a regional thing that could bring people together to celebrate something that's a little bit, curious. And I'm all for it, and I'm encouraging that people can go take the time to at least go explore what has become one of the most widely known stories.
Do you have a book, or are you writing a book on Aurora? Are you compiling all of this into one place?
Yes, so I was originally working on a publication with Jim Mars. He passed away, so it wasn't urgent for me to pick that back up immediately. But over the years, I have been continuing to develop that, and just recently launched a website, not just for the book, because the book, it changed in a big evolutionary process that has become more of a guide to all things Aurora as far as the legend. The website is an online encyclopedia database that will contain all information about the legend. It'll show all ways that I've been able to track down, which is hundreds of things. Newspaper articles from the late 60s up until today. So many books.
It's a lot to process.
So many things that have showed something about it on media, like podcasts. It's been all over TV. It's been on the History Channel a number of times, and in different ways. And again, it's not an attempt to try to convince people one way or the other. It's to show the historicity, to encourage the appreciation of the historical value of a story like this in a way that it's been publicized more than almost any other about an otherworldly encounter. And so the publication
in Texas, it's almost like Roswell. I mean, everyone in Texas knows about it.
Right. So the website is free and available, and it has all the information that the publication will have.
What's the website address?
AuroraLegend.com.
AuroraLegend.com.
That's it.
Okay,
and
that's easy to find.
That's just one of the ways you can go on and look at all the information for free. And I think that's one of the greatest things that we can do, is share what's available, and that way people don't get the impression that not only am I interested in the story, but I'm trying to capitalize on it or exploit it for money, because that's really not the case. And I think it's more important that people get that information either way. If they want to buy the book when that's available, they can do that, or they can just go to the website and see it all on there, and whatever,
and do their own research.
And it'll give them resources. So if it shares newspaper articles, if it shares a website's podcast, they can go to that and it'll take them there, or it'll show them my commentary on what ways that the story had been portrayed in this form or in this book, and that way they can get a sense of what it's all about, and maybe go buy that book, or go buy something that, the movie or something like that, and just get a sense of all the ways that it's been showed throughout its its existence.
Okay. I also want to shift gears while I have you here.
Sure.
You have your own podcast called The Vortex. Tell me about that.
Sure. Well, I'll just say, because I don't really consider myself much of a podcaster, I would say that my media platform is like a show, like what you have here, where I'm sitting just like this and talking with someone in a way that I'm doing it in person with them. I don't really, very rarely do I ever do any kind of virtual calls or anything like this, because I want to make it practical with whatever is happening in the instance that I have an opportunity to talk with a person of interest. So the Vortex was my way of sharing some of the interesting conversations interviews and on-location segments that I was able to enjoy. And this is its 5th anniversary. I had worked on a lot of different things before that, but I sort of rebranded it into the Vortex because it's kind of a fun.
And where would you find the Vortex? What's the web address for that?
It's on YouTube, and you can go to thevortex.wiki, like Wikipedia, and that's very similar to the Aurora site, except it's just all things that I've been involved with. And I do it as a form of citizen journalism. I
Right.
don't really claim to have any credentials as a journalist. I really look at it as a form of investigative reporting. I don't claim to be a credentialed scientist or anything to that effect. I appreciate citizen science, and I think that I like doing what I can to help connect people together and connect information and share that in ways that I was inspired when I first started looking into these topics over a decade ago. And I thought, with the minimal amount of know-how that I have and functionality through simple things like a telephone, you can put in your hand and record anything these days. Why not? And so I figured I have an opportunity because of connecting with so many interesting individuals. For one, Jim Mars connected me with, and I was fortunate that he introduced me to a lot of people. So that helped me to branch out into these interesting communities. And I find a lot of what I've done over this time has been a work of cultural anthropology. So as fascinated as I am in the many different types of phenomena and the mysteries of the unexplained and all that, I'm just as fascinated in the communities of people and the subcultures that
Right.
are, involved with this. And so for the show, I say that we explore the mysteries of the world and beyond, and that we won't know if we don't go. And I
Right.
think that, it just shows that there are a lot of people doing incredible things. And I do the little that I can that, to make a contribution to help with that. And so that's the Vortex.
And you cover a lot of mysteries. I mean, you study UFOs, you study Bigfoot, you study other strange mysteries, I guess like Bermuda Triangle or something like that. So tell me a little about what other mysterious things that you're fascinated with.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Bigfoot is one of them, and I'll be the first to say I don't have any answers. I think that what's really important to acknowledge for many people, but for myself especially, is that, getting involved in any of this has allowed me to realize in a bit of a humbling way that there are so many more questions that I have now, and difficult sort of conundrums about the reality of a lot of this than before I got involved. And I'll admit that I think that there needs to be a lot more critical scientific work done to help shed some light on these things with open-mindedness. I consider myself an open-minded skeptic because I came into a lot of this very naive, and I think that what's helped me out is realizing there are a lot of difficult challenges in navigating the field in the community, because a lot of times people do mean well, and then unfortunately sometimes there are those who exploit the naivete of others. And unfortunately, because we can often as a community be very gullible, we want things to be more exotic than they actually are, and we are easily able to buy into things with very little to no substance. And so I've really tried to rework my own disposition on many of these areas. So Bigfoot falls into cryptozoology, and I think it's fascinating. I've never had an encounter myself, but
I was going to ask you, have you had mysterious weird things happen to you?
I've had some weird things. I've never encountered what I would call a cryptid. I've seen some strange things in the sky, nothing that I would say is definitive, like a daylight disk or anything to really make a platform to springboard off of. And I think that it's really important that that we have a way for people that do have incredible accounts to feel like they can share in a supportive network in a way that they're not immediately going to be ridiculed, because that will still happen and there's still a stigma behind that.
And the Vortex is a place. Can people call in and tell you their encounters or go into events that have happened?
Somewhat. I basically manage some networking groups that people can share. I have the Texas UFO Network, and I have the Texas Cryptozoology Network. These are not necessarily investigative groups. They are more of a networking community for people to find resources if they feel like they want to share a post or
Are these
report
Facebook
things.
groups?
They're on Facebook, and people can go on and share or find information. And I think what's helpful is that it's with people who aren't just only going to think you're crazy or something to that sense. But I think it's really important that there are networks that are supporting to these ideas so that we can at least look into it seriously without it immediately just being swept under the rug and thought, well, that's someone's just psychotic or crazy. But I think that because of my own involvement, it's difficult for me to take such an influx of reports on my own because I'm not a large organization and I can only do so much as myself. But I like to at least defer people to groups, information, organizations, resources that they can utilize in an effort to connect with others, or groups or things that they can utilize that way. But when it comes to some of these other interesting, mysterious topics, cryptozoology, I find that my involvement, like I said, has also shifted not just into investigating the phenomenon of whatever type, but also the community of people is interesting. And I've found that I've been doing a lot of ethnographic work, and ethnography is a cultural study. And so what I've found myself doing over the years is connecting with these various groups, and the people in these groups have many different outlooks. And to me, that's fascinating. And I don't subscribe to a singular point of view with any of them, but I've found myself able to appreciate different points of view from participating within those communities. And this is what cultural anthropology is all about. And I find that with how I've been involved in this way, my efforts have shifted more to, and in addition to doing what I can to further my own field investigative work, but to also develop ethnographic work through these different communities as well, within ufology, within cryptozoology, within the paranormal community. So I think that these things are fascinating in their own separate ways, but they also, there's a lot of crossover. There's a lot of parallel between the different communities and how they conduct research, how they conduct investigative field work, how they interpret their own subject matter in a way that some people attempt to elicit a response from the phenomenon, whether you're, if it comes to UFOs, whether you're out doing a meditative group work for CE5, for, contact, whether you're looking for Bigfoot and you're doing vocalizations or wood knocks, whether you're with a paranormal group at a haunted location and you're using EVPs, or you're trying to call out to spirits. These are all the same things. Everyone who's doing these things is attempting to elicit responses from some unknown factor, something. Yeah. And to me, I've found that this is really an important cross-cultural phenomenon. And again, as much as it's interesting to look into the phenomena of these things, the communities are interesting, and the various people, the individuals, how media plays a role. Things can get very sensational. There are very serious scientific researchers, but there are also media personalities. And the reality is that the way in which most people connect with information is not always through scientific journals. Unfortunately, even though they have a lot of really good information, the masses of people are really beholden to a lot of the media machine and how that's distributing information through
social
network
media.
television and social media, and how things become more widely accessible is not always through the most credible outlets. So
do you have meetups, local places where you meet in person with these groups?
Well, I think that it's important to show, like we're doing here. This is a great example of an event that has of some variety of different things. I'll be doing a talk here in a little bit on cryptids, like Bigfoot and other strange creature encounters, and it's also great because you have people talking about the paranormal.
Right.
You have people talking about different things when it comes to metaphysical concept. You gave a talk about UFOs and experiences in that, and I think that it's important that we have groups like that meet at events like this. So I try to share about events like this all over the state and beyond, so that people at least know that there are ways to get involved in connecting with community of like-minded others, and that they can at least see that there are people who are interested and are willing to open up a dialogue about this in a serious way. So I try to share about these types of events, whether they're local small-scale meetups or they're large-scale conferences. I think it's important that we show that there is a community of people, there's a contingent of people who are willing to do what they can to make sure that we have ways to get together and make progress in these different arenas. So I try to share what I can, even if I'm not involved.
Okay, so you've got the Vortex, that's your essentially a podcast. You have multiple Facebook groups that people can find you in. You have one for Texas too, don't you? A Texas UFO group?
The Texas UFO Network and Texas Cryptozoology Network as well.
Right. Okay. And you got a book on the way.
It's in the works, but the website is the important thing to really mention. The Aurora Legend site is auroralegend.com, and that will have all the information the publication is to follow. And I think that for anyone interested in that, you'll find out anything about Aurora that you maybe you've heard before. You can find out where that information comes from and maybe a little bit more. So,
okay. Daniel, thank you so much for being my guest today.
It's been an honor. I'm glad to be here.
We will be back with more on The J. Michael Show.
Goodbye.